Hey, everybody, welcome back to SafeDefend Live. Doc, it's been forever. We've kind of been doing other stuff. We've missed you, your expertise. We had a school shooting, I guess it was 2 days ago, and sad, small kids getting shot. But today, I think let's talk to everybody what the difference between a threat assessment and a risk assessment, because they're distinctly different, and there's a lot of confusion out there from our discussions. So I think it'd be great to educate everybody on the difference between the two, what they are, and how they work. How's that sound?
That sounds awesome. That's actually
Awesome.
something that happens a lot. And by the way, I missed you. It's nice to be back. I really enjoy doing these. So, I was the reason I thought about this. We discussed this occasionally, and I think we've actually talked about it a little bit, maybe I don't know,
Yep.
a year or so ago. But it's worth kind of updating and talking about again. I've been doing a lot of threat assessments, right? Training, a lot of threat assessment training, right? And oftentimes, especially school counselors or mental health professionals or employee assistance people and things like this, they get brought in to do, threat assessments, right? And I know a number of like psychologists, clinical psychologists, and they'll be asked by a school, usually a school, to kind of come in and review, or they're asked to do or help with a threat assessment. And a number of schools that I'm familiar with, they don't really have a threat assessment, a so-called team, because they don't really don't
Yep.
have it, right? And what they do is they say, okay, look, we got the mental health professional, and we got a kid who is kind of a problem kid. We send them to them, and they do the therapy and things like this, and they'll do a risk assessment, and then I'll talk to these mental health professionals and stuff like this, and they say, talk about threat assessment. They'll know we already do that, and I said, well, what is it that you're doing? And they tell me, and it's kind of like a need to kind of educate them on, say, yeah,
Yep.
what you're doing is really important, right? But it's not threat assessment, and the approach you're taking is really dealing with the probabilities of what's likely to happen. We're looking at a threat assessor from the standpoint that something's happening now, right? It's not just, kid gets on the radar. You can go, kind of two different directions. You can go into a risk assessment versus a threat assessment. Now, I just kind of want to bring up the difference, especially for mental health professionals or people, school counselors, and people who are used to doing risk assessments, and really just put out there that it's two very different things, two very important things. You need both, right? But when we're talking threat assessment, we're not looking at, probabilities and things like this. And so, the main thing I think to get across on a, risk versus threat assessment is a risk assessment is the probability of violence going to happen. And it's usually geared toward the general population or subsets of the evaluation. And probably the most common one is when you have a child who's demonstrating, thoughts of suicide ideation or things like this, and it becomes, problematic, right? And so they're like, oh, well, we got to get this child checked, right? And then they will then go to the mental health professional, and they'll do a risk assessment, risk as to the probability that this kid might commit suicide, right? Or the probability that this kid might, be violent. And what they do is they'll use these structured clinical assessments, and they're basically like psychological tests, right? But it's kind of done not just, hey, take this papered form. It's kind of like they go through the questions, and they have, it's like a actuary type thing, right? And based on the answers to the questions and what they determine in the face-to-face stuff, after they do this clinical threat assessment, they come up with an estimate of probability of violence, right? But the problem with this is that these assessments are based on, kids at high school age, right? And they look at, okay, kids at high school age under these circumstances, here's where their baseline is supposed to be. And then if it's, if this kid is here, we determine the level of risk. Is it low? Is it medium? Is it high? And then what they do is then they use that as a basis for, psychotherapy or whatever it is they're going to do, right? And these structured clinical assessments, the problem is that, targeted violence is very, very small, right? And the risk of violence can't be driven by a general base rate of like things. So just like when you do, an analysis or like a bell curve, right? So that's a really simple thing is, teachers will grade students, right? And you're going to have students that are going to be A students, B, C, D, and F students. And if you have a proper grading scale, you're going to have a bell curve. Most students are going to fall in the C range, B, C, D range. And then you got smaller amount that's kind of out here in the A and a smaller amount that's in the F. And if you have this, that tells you that, hey, we got a pretty good class, right? Or the lesson plan is set up so that we're basically, doing a fairly good job. In other words, we're not inflating grades or deflating grades or things like this. And when you do this with violence in a risk assessment, it's kind of the same thing. But the problem is that we're not looking at risk factors for general groups of people. The threat assessment is actually geared towards a specific individual versus a group or category of people. And that's the real difference. And so when you have a child that gets on the radar for being, concerning behavior, and you do a risk assessment, that is an analysis of this, answering questions and, and all this other stuff, or probability that this kid is probably going to is more so than not apt to be, or we're going to suggest that they're more at risk for suicide. That doesn't tell us anything in threat assessment. The threat assessment is actual threat assessment geared toward a specific individual. So when you have a child or a kid or employee, whatever it is, that pops up with concerning behavior, you got two avenues. You got risk and threat. And most people are geared towards risk because that's where the training is. That's where they have all the scales and the questionnaires and things like this. And so as as a principal, as a superintendent, as a manager, as an HR, things like this, when you have problem individuals that are on your radar, you have to know the difference between a risk and a threat. Risk is not going to stop the threat. All right, so what? His probability of violence. We're looking at that specific individual based on these behaviors on the pathway, the direct behaviors, and factoring all the stuff that we always talk about here, on SafeDefend Live.
Yep.
And so that's the main point. And so you don't really have to know a lot of details, but just know the difference is that risk is probability and threat is directly related to an individual versus a class of individuals.
Well, I think it's important too, because we've talked about this at length, what the threat assessment team looks like. And the threat assessment team is more than just a counselor, and to me, that's the big differentiator for schools. If you want a threat assessment, you need to get law enforcement involved. You need to get the counselor involved. You need to get administration involved. You need to look at all the data you've retrieved on this person and have each specific area of expertise look at it and grade them on where they are on the path to violence. And that may come with an interview from the administrators with the help of your SRO or law enforcement to ask the right questions, see if they're going to harm somebody, if there is a potential for violence in that sense. So, the risk assessment is a psychological evaluation of an individual by a counselor, by a professional in that space. A threat assessment is a team with different areas of expertise looking at the entire picture to see where they are on the path to violence and how to mitigate. Is that fair?
Right, exactly. And and the only thing I'd add to that is a threat assessment. You are really looking at a specific individual versus risk, as in, they might be in the future based on their background and how they answer questions. They are higher risk of violence, but there's no threat assessment. There's no way to gauge if they are on that pathway, or if you can do some sort of forecasting to say, yeah, he continues on, we don't do something here, violence is going to happen.
Well, Doc, I really appreciate that explanation. Hopefully it'll be helpful to our school administrators and teachers that watch this to help them build their team. If you guys need help, reach out to us at SafeDefend. But more importantly, another sad week in the United States with a school shooting. I'm going to ask all of you to hug your kids if you have kids and tell them you love them, because you never know when something bad's going to happen. And no, we're praying for those families that have injured children or lost their children this week. No, SafeDefend is here with you. We want to help make your school safer so you don't have to worry about that every day when your kids go to school.
Absolutely, 100%. I'm with you, man.
So with that, everybody, it's Doc and Dave. We are out of here.
Have a great